I hate to use medical metaphors right now, but the specialty retail sector was put into a coma for 3 months. What the
So when the virus reared its ugly head beginning in January, there was very little that governments could do because there was no vaccine or treatment. There still isn't. And the most important thing for most governments around the world was to suppress the virus in order to prevent a more catastrophic outbreak and a catastrophic result in terms of infections and deaths. And the only way they could do that would be to compel people to stay apart from one another. And the best way to do that was to put economies into a coma. That is to sort of shut down economic activity in order to keep people apart, in order to suppress the virus, hope that that would lead to the virus disappearing, and then set the stage for a recovery. At the same time, governments could use their tools to protect people and businesses from the ravages of the downturn, and then also put in place strong regimes of testing and tracing in order to suppress future outbreaks should they arise without having to shut down economic activity.
Hi, I'm Rachel Williamson, the owner of a company called Running Great Stores. As you can imagine, it's all about retail. Stores had virtually no notice that they were closing. They went from being open and planning for Easter and for spring break and for peak to printing off a sign or handwriting a sign, taping it to their door and telling their teams, hey, you're not coming in, we're closed. And I think at that moment in time, everybody thought this would last for a couple of weeks. Companies still were paying their associates, even though the stores weren't open. But then all of a sudden, 2 weeks came, 3 weeks came and went, and people started to realize that this was going to last quite a bit longer. We had associates that, they didn't know if and when they would ever be back in their stores. They had inventory that had been piling up and markdowns they were going to do and floor sets that they were going to complete, and it all came to a standstill. After 2 or 3 weeks, many companies actually started furloughing their associates, which meant they were still employed, but they just simply stopped being paid for the work that they were doing, which put an enormous amount of stress on thousands and thousands of retail associates, not only in the US, but really I'll say around the world at different times. But teams had to apply for unemployment. Many states were behind in the payout because they were inundated with unemployment claims. More than just retail, was impacted. I know many managers were rushing to Walmart and Target to find jobs just to be able to keep paying the bills and to put food on the table. Companies just couldn't tell their associates when they were going to be back at work. But at the same time, if you were a smaller retailer, you were furloughed immediately. They didn't have the money, the cash flow turned off. There are a lot of retailers out there that have brick and mortar stores that don't have an online presence. And this is really a situation where they realized, oops, I should have. So you had those folks who just like the money just stopped, and so many associates without jobs.
And this is what happened around the world at varying times, to varying degrees, and with varying degrees of success. It started in China, and China had a big outbreak, but it also had a draconian lockdown, which led to a very sharp drop in economic activity. But it was a success in that the virus was suppressed, and that set the stage for a strong rebound of activity. In Europe, which came later, there was a big outbreak in Italy and Spain and elsewhere, also very draconian lockdowns, leading to a much sharper drop in economic activity than we saw here in the US, but also a success in that the virus was substantially suppressed, and that set the stage for recovery. Although in Europe right now, we're seeing a revival of the virus in some countries, in Spain, in France, and in the UK, and that's worrisome. Now, here in the US, the situation was a little bit different. We did not have a central governmental authority to impose a lockdown. Rather, we had 50 different states which acted in 50 different ways at 50 different times and to varying degrees of success. And despite that, there was a very sharp drop in activity because of lockdowns, but also because with the virus out there, people were nervous and avoided social interaction in ways that led to a drop in consumer spending. In fact, there's evidence that the drop in consumer spending was not that different, whether it's in a state that had a very sharp draconian lockdown and those that didn't. It seems that the thing that really made the difference was the fear of consumers. So we did have a big drop in activity. And then by May, most states started to reopen here in the US, even though we hadn't met the guidelines set by the White House, which was to have 2 weeks of consistent declines in infections as well as a strong regime of testing and tracing. And so when those states reopened, it was almost a signal to people that it's okay to go back out, go to the beaches, go to the restaurants, go to parties, and they did. And then we had another surge of the virus this past summer, which had, again, a negative effect on economic activity.
You know, when we reopened stores in May, we didn't know if customers would come back. I think that was the question. Are they willing, after being locked down in their house for a couple of months, are they willing to venture back out or are they afraid to? Safety has been first and foremost. And I would say from the day we reopened back in May until today, safety has maintained the top priority for every retailer out there. In fact, in all my years in working in store operations, I can confidently say I've never seen the consistent execution in every location, every day that I have seen with COVID. And when I've asked retailers, what do you attribute this consistency in the execution? And they all come back to the exact same answer. And that is associates are afraid of getting sick. They really are. They're afraid of taking the virus home to their families. So when the day is done, it's good to see that companies put structure in place and associates were willing to follow that.
We're now in the early part of the fourth quarter, and there is a possibility that we could have some negative consequences for the economy in this quarter for two reasons. One is if the virus gets out of control during this quarter, that will have negative consequences because consumers will avoid social interaction because of fear of the virus. And it's still early in the quarter now, so it's a little too early to say how significant that will be. The other factor would be fiscal policy. We did have the expiration of fiscal stimulus at the end of July. And depending on what the Congress does or doesn't do, we could have negative consequences for consumer spending during this quarter because of that expiration, which did lead immediately to a drop in consumer income and could lead to a further drop in consumer spending.
Back in March, when the pandemic hit, state by state, retailers began to shut down. Even e-commerce ground to a halt because supply chains were strained and retailers were scrambling, trying to figure out what to do. As a consumer, you felt it was unsafe to receive packages, so you really only limited your activity to essentials. And in Brooklyn, where I was living at the time, it was very scary. It was kind of the epicenter of the pandemic. We heard sirens every day, and we were afraid to leave our homes. We left only every 3 days to get essentials or for brief walks outside. So it was really very, very severe back in March. Today, the vast majority of retail stores have reopened, but traffic is still down severely, about 30%. E-commerce continues to chug ahead, with most retailers seeing even a doubling of their expectations, and they are working hard to try to fulfill that demand. They've rapidly adjusted their cost structure, looked for rent concessions, furloughed, and in some cases permanently laid off staff, announced more store closures, and are really leaning into fulfilling a lot of this digital demand. We've seen more than a dozen bankruptcies, really some big bellwethers like J. Crew and Neiman Marcus, who were on the brink for some years, but nonetheless, this pandemic has kind of been the tipping point, and so we've seen just a record amount of change over a very short period of time. Pre-pandemic, we were seeing retailers really invest in multi-channel capabilities. They were investing steadily. There were elevated store closures for a period of about 5 years, but we were seeing this steady state investment, and margins had been coming down as a result of investment in digital and a shift towards that channel. Also, we were seeing disruption from digitally native brands, and we were seeing large retailers like Walmart, Costco, and Target really taking share. So that was a very difficult backdrop for most retailers to be participating in. If you think about those large retailers taking market share, it just sucks all the oxygen out of the room. And that was the backdrop heading into this pandemic. Now we've just gone through this event where everything had to happen at lightning speed, and perhaps that's kind of jolted the retail industry into action a bit, and maybe that's a good thing. Retail earnings in the first half of the year were the worst in history. In many cases, this pandemic has permanently changed business models, resource allocation, and profit margins. So we don't really know what the other side looks like.
To set the table up a bit, we think Columbus is the star of the Midwest and have the data to back that up. Columbus is number one among major Midwest metros over the last decade in population growth, job growth, GDP growth. Columbus is also in the top 10 for millennial share of the population, and the only one of the 10 in the eastern half of the US. Columbus is number one in the Midwest for net migration of millennials and number 12 in the US. I'll return to this point later because it pertains to the talent in specialty retail. Columbus has a diversified economy where no major sector represents more than 18% of employment. Headquarters include Cardinal Health, Nationwide Insurance, Honda North America has their headquarters here, plus R&D and manufacturing. DHL Supply Chain is here. JP Morgan Chase has more than 20,000 employees, which is their third largest presence after New York and London. Cover My Meds, Root Insurance, each grew to $1 billion unicorn status and beyond. And then there are the data centers of Amazon, Facebook, Google, among others. But we're here to talk about retail, right? A number of the larger headquarters are listed here. These include the underlying brands too, like Hollister for A&F, or Value City for American Signature, which is affiliated with the Schottenstein Stores Corporation. The bottom row are subsidiary brands. You have Harry and David under 1-800-Flowers, Justice and Lane Bryant under Ascena, that have maintained a significant office presence locally after acquisition. When we focus in on the apparel headquarters, the concentration of employment in Columbus is far beyond any other metro. Apparel headquarters share of employment here is 7.8 times larger than the apparel headquarters share of employment across the US. Key professions specific to the industry like fashion design, buying, merchandising are also heavily concentrated here. Columbus has 3.2 times the concentration level seen across the US, ranking fourth behind New York, LA, and Portland in this measure. If you take out footwear, Columbus is third after New York and LA. And it's not just the headquarters and the designers, merchandisers, other professionals based in those offices. There's a whole ecosystem of related activities and services and distribution, logistics, technology, marketing, research, design, real estate. Obviously, retail has been going through some challenges. This chart shows changes in U.S. retail sales by category between January and August, seasonally adjusted. On your left, you have non-store retailers, e-commerce up 22%, followed by home and garden at 15%, and sporting goods, hobby items at 11%. On your right, there are the restaurants and bars that are down 20%, and then clothing stores are tied with gas stations at minus 15%. So even though retail overall is up now compared to January, there has been a dramatic shift across categories. We're starting to see the effects on the retailers' corporate headcounts here. This is the month-on-month change in the number of Columbus area LinkedIn profiles for each company from March to August. It's been negative through the pandemic, with acceleration in recent months as more retailers see the need for permanent cuts. It's a difficult situation for sure. At the same time, there's some opportunity here. Finding talent is always the number one issue among employers we talk to across industries, even now. So a big question for us as an economic development agency is whether this talent that's being laid off will stay in Columbus or go somewhere else. Many of the challenges we're seeing now in retail aren't new. Back in 2018, when One Columbus was working on our current strategy, we produced various internal analyses of our key industries. Here's a summary slide from then on trends, risks, and opportunities for Columbus's retail headquarters. By no means am I saying that we at One Columbus are retail geniuses. We're approaching this as generalists, scanning the landscape, and saw that there was already a lot of talk about pressures from Amazon, e-commerce, private labels, ESG and transparency, data analytics. All of these trends have been brought forward during the COVID pandemic. We've seen a number of companies that have distribution, fulfillment operations in Columbus more than double their e-commerce in the past quarter. Last year, Lululemon had a goal to double e-commerce by 2023, and that ended up happening in a quarter. FedEx had a 2026 timeline to reach 100 million e-commerce packages a day. They now expect to hit that mark in 2023. In summary, here's what we see looking ahead. Again, we're not retail industry geniuses. We gather a lot of intel following our key companies and their industries. All those buzzwords like omnichannel and BOPUS, they've very fast become reality. So definitely continued acceleration to all the trends discussed, though not all clear how things will shake out, who's going to get it right. We have companies here like L Brands and A&F that are on the path to become smaller, more e-commerce oriented, more profitable companies. Both turned profits in Q2, which is really astonishing when you put that into context. The competitive landscape will thin out. There are the headline bankruptcies, obviously, but you also have some of the startups that will fade away, like all the lingerie e-commerce startups that were cutting into Victoria's Secret, for example. Not all of those are going to survive. Part of this is about who is strong or weak coming into the pandemic, and part of this is timing. You have some firms and investors coming at this now with lots of cash, while others have assets that got very distressed very fast. For Columbus, we see an opportunity to retain the talent that's coming out of the retailers. Some will switch industries. We're talking with our higher ed institutions on how that might be facilitated. But we're also working our butts off to support any growth opportunities or shifts among existing retailers and to attract new retailers to the region. Ultimately, we think that Columbus can have a more diversified, robust retail industry than there is now. With that, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the series.
So viewer, why should you watch this series? Here's my argument. First, the mall has played a huge part in developing our nation's aesthetic culture. For most of you watching, the mall was likely your introduction to fashion as expression, to aspirational lifestyle merchandising, and highly designed environments. And how many of these images are burned into our brains? Second, Specialty retail has been forever evolving and in the process has created substantial wealth for its owners and employees. The Limited was the nation's single best performing stock across all industries from 1975 to 1990. Gap Inc. was the second best performing retail stock throughout the 1990s. Through the 2000s, millennials drove the growth of teen and fast fashion retailers. Think Abercrombie, American Eagle, Hollister, Hot Topic, Pink, Zumiez, Forever 21, and H&M. In a Harvard Business Review study published in 2015, among the best financially performing CEOs in the world were Inditex CEO Pablo Isla at number 3 and Limited Brands CEO Les Wexner at number 11. Over the last decade, the sector has welcomed a slew of digital-first retailers with new business models, millennial attitude, and a new set of values. Think Stitch Fix, Warby Parker, and Reformation. In fact, it is this forever trying to stay in front of this fast-moving culture, of the constant tumult, of striving for the edge, is what draws so many of us into this career. But this awful pandemic has been absolutely punishing, vastly accelerating the pace of change and mounting fatalities. Now, this series could be a sad story about the permanent crippling of an industry. But remarkably, the story emerging from those speaking in this series, very much to my own surprise, is one of renewal and, yes, reformation. How is that? The structural oversupply that had plagued the industry for at least a decade was shocked into balance by stripped-down inventory buys and a crippled supply chain. From the subsequent bankrupting of upstream factories to the shuttering of end-of-stream stores, substantial capacity was quite suddenly removed from the marketplace. Legacy retailers are responding, changing their mindsets from thinking stores first to digital first, by listening much more closely to their customers and building leaner, faster, and more responsive business models. Why? Because their survival depends on it. The future of specialty retail is up for grabs. If you want a piece of it, you need to pay attention. Thanks for watching, and join us for the next episode, Reformation.